Welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today we're talking about some of the stories we've been covering this week. Gennady, we'll start with you. About a year ago, the nonprofit Pets in Need signed a letter of intent with the city to take over operations of the animal shelter. So why don't you give us an update on what's going on with that?
Yeah, this is an issue that stretches back to 2012 when Mountain View left and the animal shelter, which everyone acknowledges is cramped, has been just like losing a lot of money or costing about $900,000 a year. And so the city's been trying to find a nonprofit partner to take over operations, make things more efficient. And as you mentioned last year, they did sign this letter of intent with Pets in Need, a nonprofit in Redwood City, with the idea that they would take over operations this year, possibly like in the March-July timeframe. As we learned like in the last few months, that proved to be a very ambitious, aggressive timeframe. They haven't even signed an operations agreement yet, much less begun the takeover. But there's been some progress. Next week, actually the week after, on August 27th, the City Council will discuss the subject for the first time in a year and give staff directions on the biggest issue that's currently on the table, which is basically what to do with the shelter.
Was the letter of intent, the initial plan was for them to build a completely new shelter, correct?
Yeah, the long-term plan is to have a new shelter, and that's something that city and Pets in Need are both committed to. But that creates a problem. It's almost like a catch-22 because to get there, the Pets in Need has to operate out of the existing one, and the existing one they want to get rid of ultimately. But Pets in Need will not move in unless they upgrade the existing one to a level that would satisfy Pets in Need and that would accommodate their services. So it's almost like they have to save the shelter so they could destroy it, and then later on they have to destroy it so they could save it by building a new one. So it's a bit of a long negotiations.
Would provide all of the funding to upgrade the existing shelter, or where is all that funding coming from?
That's the idea, and that's one of the things that the City Council is going to be discussing on the 27th is how much the city can provide. It's a number that's been fluctuating pretty wildly, and that's one of the reasons why the negotiations are taking so long. The city had budgeted about $800,000 for various capital fixes, but after that, Pets in Need had their own estimators come in and see what it would take to make the needed improvements, which is basically more space for staff, improvements to the medical clinic, and new dog kennels. And they decided it would be like $1.85 million. And then later, the city had its own estimate after that, and the cost estimate went up to like $3.4 million. So it's like 4 times as much as the city had budgeted essentially. And there's understandable reluctance for the city to fork over that kind of money for a facility that everyone acknowledges needs to be replaced sometime soon.
So I have another question, is what's happened to services in the meantime? Didn't they get rid of the spay and neuter clinic, for example?
I think that was a temporary thing last year, and I haven't checked back on that particular issue, but from what Rob DeGoes told me back when we wrote about this a while back, this had to do with staffing issues that were in interim. As far as I know, like the animal shelter is still functioning kind of like as it has. So I don't know of any significant service cuts that it's experienced, but obviously its condition hasn't gotten any better. So from that perspective, it's
has that been sort of the delay? Is just figuring out how to update the shelter until they can build a new one? Is that why things haven't really moved forward?
It's one of the delays. It's probably the biggest issue, but there's also a few others. The city and Pets in Need both want Pets in Need to move into the shelter, but their missions aren't exactly the same. The city wants to bring down the costs, make it more sustainable, not necessarily revenue neutral, but at least more economical, and they want a new facility. Pets in Need, I talked to the executive director this week, and he basically, their mission isn't really to run a new Palo Alto shelter, it's more to expand the organization's mission, which is kind of expand the no-kill movement, take in more animals from other areas that would be killed and kind of, set them up for adoptions. So in some ways, in many ways, these missions align, but the one place where it does not is this issue of how much capacity the shelter needs. Palo Alto doesn't necessarily want to spend a lot of money so that Pets in Need could take in pets from Fresno or other parts of the state. It's mostly like a Palo Alto, Los Altos Hills service. Whereas Pets in Need is mindful of the fact that it does have this broader philosophy that it wants to promote, and so it wants to make sure it has the necessary capacity. So the agreement in the letter of intent kind of called for a certain amount of money that that Palo Alto would pay to Pets in Need. I think it was like $650,000 a year or something. But I think the organization is looking for more flexibility. What if we get more dogs and cats than we expected? Can we raise it? And so...
What are some of the improvements that Pets in Need is hoping for? I know they want to add a certain number of kennels. What are some of the specifics?
Like, I think size is the biggest issue, and that's something that the city has acknowledged, and that was a subject of that really damning audit in 2015. It talked about like one carpeted room where there's like snakes and different animals kind of hanging out with employees because there's not sufficient space. And so they definitely want to have expanded space. And on top of that, they're going to have more staff. They're looking to have about 14 people there as opposed to like 10 or 11. So, and they want to have like educational areas, which they think are key to kind of bringing the community and the organization together, which is crucial towards further fundraising efforts. And so space is the biggest. Second biggest is the medical clinic, which everyone also agrees is completely like obsolete and it's too small. So they want to renovate that. So those are the two most urgent. The third one is increasing the number of kennels. There's 26 now, and they want an additional 16. But from what Al Malika, the executive director of SNE, told me, he said basically they could start operating without that being in effect, and then kind of have that be an intermediary step. But since that third step is like $2 million in itself, this might be a subject of some debate when it gets to the council. Like, do we want to install 16 kennels and then a few years later get rid of everything? So,
the other question I have is, does Pets in Need, do they see like a way that they need to separate out? Let's say, I can't see Palo Altans having to pay for animals that are brought in from Fresno, for example. So do they see like they would accept money from the city for city-type services and then do fundraising for their additional goals, or they expect the city to fund everything?
I think a lot of their operating costs right now comes from donations, and Al told me that will continue to be the case. So the city will certainly pay some of the costs, for which they're compensated in part by partners from Los Altos and Los Altos Hills. But I think a lot of it will come from donations, and I think also to address the issue of residents versus people from far away, I think the shelter always had like a tiered rate structure, I believe. So people could come in from far away, but it would cost them more. The details have yet to be hashed out because they haven't reached an operating agreement, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's still that kind of arrangement where you charge more from people from the outside. But hopefully that's something that we will see in August 27th. Like, the staff report for this hasn't come out yet, so there might be more details forthcoming next week when it does. But so everything I learned was just from talking to the city, and that's a need. And just one last thing that happened since we last discussed it. There's been a fundraising study that was conducted that the city paid for, which showed how likely Pets in Need is to raise the money it needs for a brand new shelter, which could be up to $20 million. And it was kind of a mixed bag. It was a little underwhelming. I mean, even to raise like $10 million, there was like a 30% chance, something like that. This was based on interviews with potential donors and kind of an evaluation of the organization's effectiveness and how badly board members want to give, that kind of stuff. And so there's a recognition that, you know, even if you upgrade the shelter, it's still going to operate for at least a few years because it's going to take some time to win the hearts and minds of the community and kind of win the hearts and minds of the major donors you will need to kind of get the big facility up and running.
Say this falls through with Pets in Need, what are the other options then? Because the city has to have an animal shelter, right?
They don't have to. They could outsource, but that's something that they tried in 2012. Okay. Or they didn't try, but they at least brought that up, and there was a huge community backlash, and they quickly backtracked from that plan. Because, I mean, they could do what Mountain View did when it left Palo Alto. It went to Savaca. There's other organizations or Humane Society or whatnot. That's a very unpopular option, and I don't think city council members, especially in an election year, will talk about closing the shelter. But the other alternative is just status quo. I mean, there's a recognition that even though the facility costs like upwards of $700,000 or $900,000, some people would say that's just the cost of providing a valuable service. They would, you know, push back against the idea that it's losing money. I mean, it's a valuable service, so you would have that. But from the letter of intent, it's very clear, and from the audit, it's very clear that status quo is not something that the city wants to have. It's the, I guess you'd say, clearly the lesser option as opposed to having pets and need take over from the council's perspective.
So the next step is the council is going to meet on this and say they hammer out some of these details.
Staff is still confident they might be able to reach an agreement this year. Basically, the council is going to give city staff additional direction of how much they're willing to spend to make these interim upgrades that Pets in Need wants. And based on the council's feedback, staff is going to go back to the table with Pets in Need, and if the council agrees to the kind of improvements that staff is asking for, which is probably going to be somewhere around $1 to $1.5 million for the interim, then they could probably hammer something out within the next few months. But again, that's very tentative considering how things have gone so far. So there's progress there, but not as fast as anybody was hoping.
Slower than we'd hoped. Okay. And now, Sue, you've been covering how the city of East Palo Alto is considering equipping the police department with tasers. So why don't you tell us what's going on there?
Okay. Well, the idea of tasers came up several years ago under the former police chief, Ron Davis. And it never really went anywhere in the council. I mean, never really went anywhere to the point that Mayor Ruben Abrica didn't even really remember much of a conversation having taken place as he brought that up at a city council meeting. And so the police department is, I think, being mindful of the fact that in communities of color, not in East Palo Alto, however, there have been a number of shootings and fatalities as a result of police shooting suspects. And they want to avoid that type of situation. They are the last city or the last police department in San Mateo County that would have tasers. Everybody else already has them. So what they were proposing was basically to lease for 5 years from Axon, a company that was the originators of the brand Taser. Both do two things. One would be to lease 33 tasers and 33 body-worn cameras. It's another thing that the police department doesn't have. And so this would ostensibly make it so that they would not have to use some lethal force in some very serious situations where it's escalating, and at the same time also be transparent because they'll have the body-worn cameras and people will be able to see what kinds of incidents are going down and what the police reaction is. And that would also clarify a lot of things when people are complaining as well, that maybe they feel that they were not treated right by the officers.
And the city approved the body cams this week, right? So they're going to be getting those.
They approved the body cams policy.
The policy.
They want to, they are in favor of the body cams, but what happened is that Axon was offering this as a package deal. So the price of roughly $214 million for 5 years, that price tag is based on
214 million?
I'm sorry, 214,000.
Oh, scared me.
Yeah, excuse me. Let's make that correction, or we're going to get a lot of calls about that one. But anyway, the idea behind it was that they had this package deal of both the body cameras and the tasers. But if the city wants to take a step back from the tasers because they really feel there should be a lot more community input on this, and they know it's very controversial. So basically, the police department's going to get back to the city council sometime in September with a revised figure that would be based on just if they got the body cams, and then the council could decide on that.
And so I'm struck by the fact that you mentioned this is the last department in San Mateo County that would have them. Do you have any idea why that is? Is this a political decision or a community opinion, or is it a budget issue, or did it just not come up until now?
I think because in communities of color, there's been a tendency in general of abuse by police or perception of abuse by police, not necessarily in East Palo Alto, although the subject was raised by Councilman Carlos Romero that under the county, when there was the county sheriff, there were many more complaints or incidents of abuse by officers, excessive use of force types of complaints.
But I can see that as playing into both the argument for and an argument against tasers.
Yeah.
And I certainly could see that making body cameras even more imperative if there's been abuse.
Yes,
So,
I don't think there's going to be any question that they will pass the body cameras, that will be something that they'll equip the department with. But given the whole history in African American community in particular, that, of use of police dogs. I mean, I remember when the police department got started, one of the things they were not allowing was to have canines. And the reason for that was because dogs had been sicked on people, for many years. So I think it's kind of along the same lines. Part of it might be financial as well, but I think they really want to test the mood of the community, and the department has done a lot of outreach in the community to build confidence and trust. So I think now they feel this might be a move that they could make, and they want to have a less lethal use of force tool in their toolbox.
How are they going to survey the community?
Well, there'll be another meeting. There will be at least one, and probably more city council meetings where this will come up. And one of the things that came up was that the staff report this time around mentioned CEDs, which is basically conductive energy devices. And that was the term used for the tasers throughout. And nobody really knew what that was. So only 4 people spoke the last time. So they feel that now that they'll kind of advertise it more so people understand what there's going to be in terms of stun guns, that this is what we're talking about. And they expect to have many more people come out and then voice their opinions, pro and con.
And so you've done your own surveying, and we had a story this week about you talking and listening to people talk about this subject.
Yeah.
Anything surprise you? What was your take from hearing from the community on this topic?
Well, it was kind of interesting because a lot of people felt if you're going to do crime, then you're putting yourself in a position where you could have somebody use a taser on you if you're violent, if you're attacking police or being unruly. So it's sort of like there's a certain amount of responsibility that goes on to the person themselves who is potentially going to be the subject of a taser or the object of a taser. But ultimately, they felt that would be, most people felt that it was going to be a better choice, that it is something they would much rather see than somebody being shot. And they said that was a really important aspect of it. There were some people who were totally against it. They just felt that there's too much possibility for abuse, that officers could maybe torture someone with it. They wanted and I think across the board, one of the things that really surprised me was how much people were really focused on the mindset of the officers and the need to train them so that they won't panic in a situation, because they are coming up against sometimes very violent criminals that they have to deal with. And so they want better training and for there to be good oversight by the department and by those in the command staff to make sure that they understand whether or not particular officer, someone maybe who shouldn't have a stun gun, or needs more training so that emotionally when they react they won't overdo it.
So it sounds like it depends on how you frame the issue. Is it what's better, getting tased or not get tased, or what's better, tased or get shot? It depends on how you frame it. It seems like that's where you would come on in that debate.
Well, it was really interesting too when I went to the senior center and I went into their lunchroom and talked to them, and now they had the most heated discussions out of anybody, because they were sitting there. One person said, I'm totally against the tasers. It's just going to be like with the guns, where they're just going to go and unload them into people and they'll just keep shooting them, which if you have a taser, you could put it on stun mode and put it against someone and keep, or stun drive, I guess they call it. You put it on someone and keep tasing them with it, but that's only to cause like a pain shock. It doesn't incapacitate them. But if you use the wires and the prongs, then it has to be reloaded. If there's going to be a time delay, I think those are maybe 1 to 3 uses before you have to put in a new cartridge. So then there were other people who were saying, well, what's the, what would you prefer? Do you want to get shot right off the bat?
Yeah,
or that was one of the quotes. Or would you rather have somebody use a taser on you? I'd rather have a taser. There were even people that said, I would rather be tortured. I'll take my risk of being tortured with a taser than being shot and killed, because you can't get up again once you've been shot.
But it sounds like there's been some consensus. I mean, even if people who are like, whether you're for or against, everyone pretty acknowledges that if they're going to be used, there needs to be a lot of training. So,
yes.
So it seems like one possible consensus is having tasers, but before them being deployed, having like strict policies and making sure that the body camera's in use and that kind of stuff.
Right. And the body camera, they had a body camera policy was discussed. there would be a separate Taser policy that would also have to be discussed. So there's room for really making sure that people get in it what they expect and that the officers are trained in that way. So I think that that's, something that they'll have to really be very careful
And
about.
I also read in your story where the tasers would be in the opposite holster and they'd be painted orange. So
they're yellow. The tasers are yellow, being the opposite holster. And there's also supposed to be a rule where you'd never take both out. So you've only got one at a time. And hopefully that would make a difference. And there's still mistakes that are made.
Yeah.
And, I think everybody acknowledges that. East Palo Alto police say that they mostly use a program of, it's escalating a scale of force. And that in mostly, I'd say about 98% of the cases, they're able to talk the suspect down or talk them out of, escalating the behavior. But there have been a couple of really serious incidents in which, domestic violence calls are really, that's a big and very, very dangerous, one of the most dangerous situations. Where they had somebody who was so big and so violent and they was throwing the police, they were saying they were throwing the officers around like rag dolls. So in that case, if they'd had somebody there with a taser, pepper spray didn't work on the guy, let's say, then the taser might have been a better choice. I think they had to bring out a beanbag gun in one case and knock the person down. So that's pretty much, I think that's the thinking, is that they would rather have this in their toolbox so they don't have to escalate it to using a gun.
How soon do you expect them to go back for the council to decide on this? Did they give any indication?
I don't know that they'll actually, what they're going to do is, this might not come back to the council for the tasers until maybe sometime late September. They're going to come back with a different pricing just to get the body cams going. And then after that, it might be sometime in October, something like that. Okay. It's a little bit further down the line. I think the police department wanted to have all officers equipped with the tasers and the body cameras by October, but it may be a little bit of a delay on the tasers.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess that wraps up today's Behind the Headlines. If you liked what you heard, press the button below or follow us on social media. If you want to stay up to date on Palo Alto news, go to paloaltoonline.com. Thanks a lot.